Hey guys, tonight we'll wander through the strange ideas people once held about the mind, madness, and mental health in medieval times, along with a handful of other odd little corners of the past. To begin, it helps to remember that the people of the Middle Ages did not draw the same line we do between the body, the soul, and the mind. For them, these were tangled together, and a disturbance in one was often thought to spill over into the others. A person who behaved strangely, who spoke to figures no one else could see, or who fell into deep and lasting sorrow, was not usually understood through the language of medicine as we know it today. Instead, their condition was read as a sign, a message, something that pointed beyond the individual toward larger forces at work in the world. Many believed that such troubles came from an imbalance within the body itself. This idea reached back to the old teachings of the Greeks, especially the notion that the body held four fluids, or humours, and that health depended on keeping them in harmony. Blood, phlegm, and two kinds of bile were thought to shape not only whether a person fell ill, but also the very temper of their character. Too much of one, too little of another, and a person might grow gloomy, restless, quick to anger, or lost in melancholy. To the medieval mind, the cure was to restore the balance, perhaps by adjusting the diet, by drawing off a measure of blood, or by prescribing rest and quiet. Yet the humours were only one part of the picture. Faith shaped nearly every explanation, and so the state of a person's soul was never far from view. Some believed that a troubled mind was a trial sent to test one's devotion, a burden to be carried with patience and prayer. Others feared that it revealed the touch of something darker, and that a person who raved or wept without end might be caught in a struggle that was not entirely their own. In this way, the same set of symptoms could be seen as either a spiritual wound or a spiritual test, depending on who was looking and what they hoped to find. Sometimes the locked room belonged not to a monastery but to a genuine public institution, the earliest ancestors of the asylum. Such places were rare for a long while, though a handful appeared in the cities of the medieval Islamic world, and by the 13th century in spots like London and Paris. What were they for? Shelter, plainly, not treatment, and never recovery. In fairness, the medieval imagination was not always harsh. A good many people held that the troubled of mind stood nearer to heaven, marked by God, or wandering that thin border between prophecy and simple oddness. Yet in everyday terms, shutting someone away for their own protection was less trouble than working out what else might be done. Households would plead with monasteries to accept an ailing relative, dangling donations as encouragement. The other option was accounting to the neighbours for why Uncle Thaddeus stood among the cabbages, hollering in Latin once more. Suppose you were a woman in medieval Europe who felt worn down, short-tempered, or given to tears, perhaps after your 11th child or your 3rd husband with plague on his breath. Congratulations. The likely verdict was hysteria. And verdict is generous, since hysteria functioned less as a diagnosis than as an all-purpose account of a woman conducting herself in a manner men found unsettling. Weeping too freely meant hysteria. Weeping too little was suspect, perhaps a sign of witchcraft. Voicing opinions, harbouring ambition, or admitting weariness pointed straight to the womb. The word descends from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. The notion, and steady yourself, was that the uterus might slip loose and roam about the body, stirring up mischief wherever it drifted. That is correct. A wandering womb took the blame for troubles ranging from unease to persistent sighing, somewhere beneath the ribs quietly circling and spoiling the day. The listed signs of hysteria took in breathlessness, jitters, fainting spells, outbursts of feeling, and, in the words of one genuine medieval writer, too much thinking. A ruinous affliction indeed. Remedies differed. A priest might urge fasting and prayer, a physician might reach for herbs, and in certain instances a rather uncomfortable manual treatment was ordered to settle the womb, carried out by midwives or, in later times, by early gynecologists working with a worrying absence of oversight. Marriage, too, was counted a cure. An unmarried woman supposedly needed a husband to steady her womb. A married one plainly required another pregnancy. Whichever way, her state of mind was answered with more labour and less rest. Should the odd behaviour persist, the visions, the reluctance at housework, the surplus of Latin-tinged thought, matters could sharpen. Some women were charged with witchcraft, since nothing announces mental illness quite like tending herbs and asking questions. The picture was not uniformly grim. Now and then women found refuge in convents, where the burdens of ordinary life eased somewhat, and inner turmoil was read as part of a spiritual trial. A few nuns even set down their distress in words that ring oddly familiar today, once you subtract the demon imagery. Even so, for a medieval woman with feelings, the surest strategy was plain: keep it quiet, keep it brief, and never converse with your cat where others might see. In an age when monks recommended fasting, priests pointed at demons, and physicians trusted in draining the very soul out through an ankle. The true champions of medieval mental care were the herbalists, frequently older women with gardens, cats, and unnervingly sharp instincts. These wise women, sometimes named cunning folk, served as the unofficial, unlicensed counsellors of the period. They did not inquire after the mood of your humours. They asked when it began, how you were resting, and whether your mother-in-law had started up again. Their approach was uncomplicated: tea, tinctures, and talking, though the talking was usually dressed up as guidance about herbs. You might sit in a smoky cottage hung with drying plants, and soon find yourself sipping a brew of valerian root and lavender while complaining about a neighbour's pig. Rather like therapy, only it also saw off warts. Sadness they met with soothing infusions, anxiety they calmed with chamomile and balm. Real anguish might earn mugwort, St. John's wort, or, in the direst cases, a firm measure of poppy extract. They called it a sleep aid. Another might call it accidental time travel. Most of these women held no formal schooling, yet their remedies grew from inherited knowledge, careful watching, and something present-day medicine terms actually listening to the patient, which sadly also rendered them suspect in others' eyes. The Church regarded them as dangers. They worked apart from the religious order, cited no scripture, and did not maintain that every ill sprang from sin. Some towns quietly valued them, others cried witchcraft the moment one grew too popular, too effective, or too self-assured in public. Even so, they were often the sole comfort available to those suffering what we would now name depression, trauma, or ordinary burnout. With luck, your village herbalist knew how to combine calming plants, light a candle for protection, and assure you that no, you were not cursed, merely tired and undervalued. Were their treatments flawless? Hardly. Sometimes they pressed onions to your feet. But set against being sealed in a stone chamber, or scolded by a monk clutching a goat's skull, the herbalist's manner amounted to something almost like holistic comfort. So far we have passed through prayer, isolation, and a charming herbalist whose license was granted by nobody at all. Yet medieval mental care held one more layer of answers, the genuinely inventive ones, the sort that leave you wondering whether the physician was improvising from his dreams and whatever sat in the pantry. Begin with the dead owl remedy. Yes, if sadness or an excess of thoughts weighed on you, one favoured cure was to fasten a dead owl to your head. The owl, an emblem of wisdom, was supposed to draw the confusion or melancholy out through your scalp. In practice, it mostly drew flies. Feeling especially anxious? Try powdered emeralds, gemstone dust in other words. Physicians advised grinding real jewels and rubbing the glittering remains on your chest or swallowing a little. It failed entirely while making short work of both your digestion and your jewelry. Then came the cures, leaning on astrology, less medicine than a mood reading from the stars. A patient's mental disturbance might be pinned on Mars being in a sour temper. The treatment? Wait for Jupiter to look kindlier. One medieval medical manual proposed wrapping the sufferer in wolfskin during a thunderstorm to frighten the madness off. Another advised whispering into the left ear of a black dog and then letting it dash away with your sorrow, a very sad, very hairy courier of grief. You could also turn up remedies involving smoked herbs packed into pigeons, which were then waved near your head. No one is entirely sure what this achieved, though it was highly aromatic and thoroughly irritating to the pigeon. And if none of it helped, there was always pilgrimage, the all-purpose medieval answer to everything. Take up your sandals, seize a staff, and trudge hundreds of miles to a holy site. With any fortune, you would either arrive at spiritual peace, or at least collect enough blisters to pull your attention off your feelings. These curious cures remind us that medieval medicine was not wholly malicious, merely badly informed, often experimental, and now and then bird-based. And if nothing else, they offered hope, which back then came about as near to Prozac as anything did. Every medieval town, large or small, seemed to keep one of them. You know the sort, oddly dressed, murmuring to himself, blessing chickens 1 hour and cursing puddles the next, the town madman. Oddly enough, society did not always cage him or call for holy water. It simply left him be. In a time when mental health was misunderstood at kindest and dreaded at worst, this carried a strange note of progress. People whose illness was plain to see were not always cast out. They were often folded into ordinary life, endured like changeable weather, or like that one goat convinced he owns the road. The madman, or madwoman, though women were sadly likelier to face charges of witchcraft, occupied an odd rung in the medieval order. Not quite a menace, not quite a joke, and once in a while held in awe. In some towns, such people were even regarded as touched by God, or granted a reluctant respect for their unpredictability. If they murmured riddles while gazing into the sun, onlookers took it for divine prophecy, or just Wednesday. They tended to acquire a nickname: Old Will the Wanderer, Mad Meg, Tom Fool. You will notice these sound a good deal like pub names, which tells you something about how much people drank while turning madness over in their minds. Such individuals frequently lived on the edges, bedding down in derelict mills, on church porches, or in actual barrels, in the manner of Diogenes. Townsfolk might hand them food or shoes, or simply keep a broad distance. Children were told not to stare, which of course guaranteed constant staring. Every so often the strange conduct prompted small kindnesses. A baker might set out crusts, a blacksmith might mend a crooked walking stick. Medieval communities, for all their superstition, could prove surprisingly gentle, especially with guilt and the dread of eternal damnation working as motivators. But once the madman turned too loud, too violent, or too disquieting, patience gave out. Then arrived the priests, the isolation, or worse. Tolerance had its edges, particularly when the afflicted stopped amusing people and began inconveniencing them. These days, we recognize depression as a tangled condition bound up with brain chemistry, life circumstances, and now and then just a dreadful Monday. In the Middle Ages, though, if you felt steadily low, drained, or as though life had become a slow-moving mudslide, congratulations. You stood guilty of acedia. Acedia was not treated as a matter of mental health. It was ranked as a spiritual failing, one of the original deadly sins before sloth eventually eclipsed it and claimed the marquee. Acedia meant sorrow in the face of divine goodness, or in plainer terms, spiritual apathy, an absence of joy, the medieval equivalent of lying abed and staring at the ceiling. Monks proved especially liable to it, a condition they lyrically named the noonday demon. Picture the scene, a monk who ought to be copying psalms instead, studying a wall and wondering what any of it is for. Today we call that burnout. In the 12th century, it was a moral emergency, demanding sharp rebuke and probably more prayer beads. Those afflicted with acedia were offered no comfort. They were instructed to pray harder, work longer, and quit being selfish. Depression was no condition, it was laziness with a rebrand. If your soul felt no joy, the fault lay with you. Perhaps you had not repented deeply enough. Perhaps you nursed a secret pride. Perhaps, and this was the last resort of accusations, you were handing Satan the victory. And should you dare voice your sorrow aloud, you were not merely pitied, but treated as contagious. Sadness might spread. It was a kind of emotional mildew, and monasteries had no wish to let it seep into the stone. The laity escaped no better. If you found no gladness in your toil, it was not because you were spent or grieving. It was a signal to seek confession and perhaps construct a whole shed out of guilt. Ironically, certain writings by monks who wrestled with acedia read remarkably like our own day. Accounts of numbness, exhaustion, restlessness, even thoughts of ending it all. Yet in place of therapy, they were prescribed fasting and the mental filing of their sins in alphabetical order. In an era when most people owned 2 shirts and one of them harbored fleas, you might suppose laughter would be welcomed. A little joy, maybe, a chuckle to carry one through the plague-ridden, mud-spattered, leech-happy ordeal of daily life. Think again. In medieval Europe, laughter was not always a mark of contentment. It was frequently taken as a moral warning sign. Certainly the peasants laughed, and the jesters laughed, and every so often even a monk let slip a smile if a goose did something truly scandalous. But the official line, handed down by theologians, chroniclers, and men who took themselves extremely seriously, held that laughter carried real danger, a doorway feeling that could lead to disorder, to sin, and heaven forbid, to dancing. The Church kept a careful eye on human frailty and cautioned against too much merriment. Thomas Aquinas, whose own sense of fun was apparently still under construction, taught that laughter ought to stay measured and serve some loftier aim. Bursting into uncontrolled laughter suggested a soul out of order, perhaps even something darker at work. Because really, who laughs for no reason at all? The answer, presumably, being anyone with a working sense of humour. Women, naturally, were judged twice over. A laughing woman was plainly scheming something, witchcraft most likely, whereas a quiet, grave woman counted as properly devout or simply badly in need of water. Nor should we overlook the laughter of the troubled. If a person laughed at the wrong moment, during a burial, say, or in the middle of milking a goat, it wasn't filed away as charming eccentricity. It was read as proof of madness, of possession, or of both at once. An unbidden giggle was, in effect, a warning flag with a tambourine attached. Certain religious orders flatly banned novices from laughing at meals, during prayer, or during nearly any activity that might kindle a bit of human warmth. Joy was acceptable in principle, but only the strictly inward variety, never the belly-shaking, wine-snorting sort that erupts when someone slips on a stray turnip. Even so, people went on laughing. Humour lived on in village festivals, in mocking verse, and in that one fellow every town seemed to have who could make peculiar noises with his armpits, but it always carried a faint edge of risk. Joy was permitted, yet never quite trusted. Nowadays, chatting with your cat reads as harmlessly odd. In the Middle Ages, it might have been heretical, mildly unsettling, and, depending on how you sounded, cause enough to question your reason or arrange a modest exorcism. Medieval society, you see, held very firm notions about who counted as suitable conversation partners. Ordinary people were fine, priests better still. But once you began talking to animals, to unseen angels, or to anything that failed to reply out loud, eyebrows lifted and torches often followed. Consider animals first. Cats already occupied uncertain ground. They earned their keep by hunting vermin, yet they were sleek, secretive, and notably absent from church. Confide in your tabby a little too regularly, and neighbours might decide she was your familiar, dispatched by the devil, to murmur forbidden knowledge about herbal cures and the location of the cheese next door. Birds drew suspicion too. Medieval bestiaries brimmed with half-true oddities, so if a person claimed a crow had foretold the future, that wasn't taken as poetry. That was an offence against good sense. Even dogs, humankind's faithful friends, stayed acceptable right up until they turned up in your dreams, draped in robes and reciting scripture. Then came the angels who, by the account of endless religious texts, were everywhere, watching, guarding, and now and then delivering grim tidings mid-thunderstorm. Report seeing or hearing them frequently, and you might be reckoned saintly, or, with unlucky timing, mad or possessed. Which verdict landed often hinged on whether you sat in a monastery or stood shouting at clouds in the market square. And then, of course, imaginary companions. Children were largely excused. Grown adults were not, and one who insisted on receiving instructions from unseen beings had a short list of possible labels: prophet, lunatic, or eventual kindling. The middle ground was thin. Curiously enough, certain mystics, Hildegard of Bingen among them, described vivid visions and exchanges with divine figures, and because they were cloistered, learned, and a touch formidable, they were left in peace. But a peasant named Bertram debating theology with squirrels was unlikely to be illuminating manuscripts anytime soon. In the medieval imagination, mental illness swung between two poles. You were either a passing curiosity or a family's buried secret, and frequently both, depending largely on whether the village market happened to be open. Take public spectacle first. Should someone visibly unwell drift through town muttering, dancing in the rain, or quarrelling fervently with a bucket, they tended to gather attention rather than contempt. In truth, they could settle into the fabric of village life, as familiar as the bell tower or that one goat forever slipping its rope. People watched, murmured, sometimes laughed, not from cruelty, or at least not always, but from an odd mingling of amusement and dread, because somewhere underneath everyone feared the same thing. That could be me by next week, given a knock to the head or a bad helping of eel pie. In certain places such people were called natural fools, a phrase that sounds cutting yet was, by the standards of the age, oddly tender. They were regarded as innocent, nearly childlike, and now and then thought to have been touched by God, by fate, or by a particularly unfortunate turn of the moon. You might come away with food, a roof, and a nickname. Hardly ideal, but in an era without therapy, it beat confinement in a tower. For families, though, the charm ran thin. If a relative was quietly suffering, perhaps low in spirit, withdrawn, or burdened by what we would now name anxiety, it was usually treated as a private affair, which in medieval terms meant never breathing a word about it. Shame carried enormous social weight, and a troubled mind in the home could stain an entire bloodline. Some households hid their afflicted members away. Others sent them off to monasteries or along pilgrimage routes, trusting sacred geography to succeed where herbal tea had failed. In sadder instances, people were cast off completely, particularly if they were seen as disruptive or, worse yet, an embarrassment at weddings. Public care for the mind hardly existed at all. Shame simply flooded the space where support ought to have stood. No clinics, no outreach, only whispered prayers and the pretense that all was well. By the close of the Middle Ages, roughly the late 15th century, plague permitting, matters slowly began to turn, not swiftly and not elegantly. But squint hard enough, and you could catch the faint stirrings of humanity edging toward compassion, one baffled scholar at a time. To begin with, philosophy and science started slipping into the discussion. Owing to Arabic medical writings preserved and translated in places such as Spain and Sicily, Western Europe was reacquainted with the ancient Greek thinkers who, while no modern psychologists, had at least entertained the notion that the human mind was not merely a demonic puppet show. Scholars grew willing to toy with the idea that madness might spring from imbalances within the body rather than only from sin or sorcery. Physicians took up treatises on melancholy and mania that carried a few less scriptural quotations and a little more anatomy. But temper your enthusiasm. Remedies still ran along the lines of apply leech to temple, though at least people were reading. In the same span, the notion of charitable care began to develop. In cities like Valencia and Cairo, early hospitals started setting patients with mental disturbances apart from the general wards. A handful even provided gardens, music, and, astonishingly, conversation. It was still a far cry from dignified, yet better than being scolded by a priest while lashed to a goat post. The printing press did its part as well. As books grew more available, ideas about the mind spread faster than fever at a midsummer fair. All of this helped sow the seeds for the Renaissance, when mental illness began its long climb upward from "you are cursed" toward "you may need support." Naturally, not everything shifted. People still dreaded what they could not grasp, and the boundary between madness and mysticism stayed as slim as a monk's bedsheet. But the foundation was set. Bit by bit, the mad ceased to be viewed solely as vessels of sin or heavenly punishment. In a genuinely radical turn, they were beginning to be seen as human, flawed, hurting, and deserving of care. Not embraces just yet. That would arrive centuries down the road. From the outside, the life of the nobility looked heavenly. Scented corridors, jewel-encrusted garments, servants poised to answer every passing wish. Whether at Versailles or inside the imperial precincts of Kyoto, the aristocracy sold an image of flawlessness, elegance held motionless like a painted portrait. What the public never glimpsed, however, was the airless reality tucked beneath the powdered faces and stiff etiquette. For a great many nobles, this life of splendor felt less like paradise and more like a cell lined in velvet. Every part of a noble's day, from the hour of rising to the correct fold of a napkin, answered to unspoken rules or ceremonial code. In France, nobles were required to take part in the lever each morning, an occasion where courtiers queued up, quite literally, to watch the king climb out of bed. Attendance was not a choice. Fail to appear in the proper rooms at the proper hours, and rumours began to circulate. Your influence dwindled, your rivals grinned. And at Versailles, forfeiting social standing was frequently more fatal than forfeiting money. Halfway around the globe, in Japan, the court nobles of Kyoto contended with a different but equally airless script. The high elite were expected to command poetry, calligraphy, music, and the delicate craft of detached composure. Every utterance, every bow, every motion of a sleeve was political theatre, and to perform it wrongly was social suicide. Even rest was a performance. A ball was not merely a gathering, it was a trial of alliances. A stroll through the garden could be a hushed battlefield of glances and disguised barbs. You were not simply living, you were acting a part in an endless drama whose audience was everyone and whose stakes were your legacy. And still, few nobles broke free, because the very advantages that won them admiration were the same ones that held them fast. Inheritance laws, arranged marriages, obligations of debt, and the ceaseless watchfulness of rivals meant they seldom governed their own destinies. Behind the shut doors of their manor houses, many nobles endured decline of the mind, quiet defiance, or spiritual despair. Yet in public they smiled. Always they smiled. Here lay the great contradiction of noble life. The more prestige one held, the less freedom one kept. They entered the world at its summit, yet often departed it without ever having lived for themselves. When you imagine a nobleman sweeping through Versailles in silk stockings, or a lady descending a staircase draped in pearls, debt collectors are surely the last figures to come to mind. But behind all that shine, a startling number of nobles were sinking financially. As it happens, sustaining the appearance of wealth cost more than genuine wealth ever did. At Versailles, appearances counted for everything. A noble might lay out more on a fresh waistcoat or ball gown than on the upkeep of a whole estate. And why? Because fashion functioned as currency. Fall behind and you disappeared, politically, socially, and in the end financially. Courtiers wagered staggering sums, not only at cards but on horses, on land speculation, on high-stakes alliances. Many mortgaged ancestral holdings to bankroll one more season of being seen. The king, for his part, offered no relief. Louis XIV especially kept his nobles near, not only in body but in purse. He urged lavish spending at court so as to keep them reliant, diverted, and loyal. A ruined noble, after all, was a noble easily managed. In England, the aristocracy fared little better. Through the Georgian years, lords and ladies frequently kept opulent townhouses in London, funded wholly on credit. Tailors, wine merchants and milliners were made to wait months, sometimes years, to be paid. Whole families teetered at the brink of ruin, pinning their hopes on a daughter marrying into money, or on some far-off cousin dying and bequeathing a title, along with an estate that actually turned a profit. Over in Russia, meanwhile, nobles held vast tracts of land worked by serfs, and yet many remained short of cash. Their wealth sat locked and unusable. Extravagant living in Moscow demanded steady borrowing. Pawnshops quietly took in tiaras and sabres. Family jewels changed hands by candlelight behind bolted doors. Japan's noble class did no better across its stretches of peace. As the samurai shifted from warrior to bureaucrat during the Tokugawa era, many nobles found themselves ceremonial yet beside the point. Stipends shrank while costs held firm. Some took on side work, actual employment in poetry schools or estate management, all to preserve appearances. But to confess financial hardship was a disgrace, so debts mounted in secret. The lesson stood plain. Nobility was never a matter of financial soundness. It was a matter of performing wealth. and often that performance came at a soul-crushing price. Among the nobility, scandal was practically a second tongue. Everyone spoke without admitting it. Affairs, jewels, hidden children, betrayals murmured behind fans. The more spotless the public face, the grimmier the private reality. Nobles held power, prestige, and privilege in abundance. What a great many of them lacked was restraint. At Versailles, courtiers lived pressed so tightly together that privacy hardly existed, and still forbidden romances thrived. Queen Marie Antoinette was accused without end of tangled affairs, supposedly with Swedish noblemen or with the ladies of her closest circle. Most of those tales were untrue, yet they clung to her because nearly everyone knew someone who was in fact behaving that way. The court ran, more or less, on gossip, and scandal was not merely permitted, it functioned as a kind of coin. Having your name linked to another's bedchamber could either lift your standing or stain your family line. Across the Channel in England, reputations were torn apart in salons and gambling rooms. Lord Byron, to take one example, was rumoured to have had children with his half-sister. That did nothing to dim his fame, but it hung heavily over his standing among the nobility. Nobles were expected to keep mistresses, only not too many, and certainly not the wrong ones. Liaisons with actresses, commoners, or foreign agents might end in exile, imprisonment, or, on rare occasions, an early death. In Imperial Russia, the court of Catherine the Great was famous for how little it hid. The Empress herself kept lovers throughout her reign, frequently chosen by her own hand and raised into positions of real authority. And it was not only Catherine. Her courtiers were forever caught up in schemes, routinely blending political manoeuvring with romantic intrigue. Affairs had less to do with love than with advantage. Even in the polished Heian court of Japan, where restraint and poetry held sway, scandal slipped through in verse and love notes. A noblewoman might welcome a visitor at midnight whose name she would never once speak. Yet her next poem, passed among the elite, might hold just enough veiled imagery to set off a blaze of speculation. The most perilous scandals, though, were the ones that never reached a letter or a courtly whisper, the ones bound up in treason, spying, and the betrayal of one's own blood. These were breathed in corridors, set down in coded messages, and tucked away in family archives. Because in noble life, scandal was never the exception. It was the wallpaper itself. Lovely, elaborate, and forever concealing the cracks beneath. For all their earthly power and comfort, nobles were often tormented by something far harder to see, the heavy burden of spiritual doubt. They possessed everything, and still grappled with a nameless dread. Being born into privilege granted no clarity about the afterlife, about right and wrong, or about any divine purpose. If anything, it tended to deepen the confusion. In Catholic France, guilt hung about the palace corridors like smoke. The same nobles who heard Mass each morning might give themselves over to excess every night. Confession was a routine, though more a matter of social display than genuine repentance. Even so, many nobles, particularly as the years wore on, were haunted by their misdeeds. Some turned to mystics and visionaries, desperate for some kind of answer. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, grew more devout toward the end, uneasy over his worldly appetites and the wars he had set in motion. All across Europe, nobles paid for churches and monasteries, not purely from devotion, but as a form of insurance. In their reasoning, a fresh chapel might purchase a cleaner conscience. 1,000 candles burning in their name could balance out a life of intrigue and indulgence. Some withdrew entirely into monastic life in old age, exchanging velvet for coarse penitential cloth. In Orthodox Russia, matters ran deeper still. Nobles were expected to uphold both the political and the spiritual order. Yet a great many wrestled with doubt, especially through the unsettled reigns of czars who called themselves chosen by God, even as they ordered purges. Some sought answers in secret prayer circles, or turned to the holy fools, wandering figures who gave up wealth and comfort to speak uncomfortable truths. These strange mystics were sometimes the only outlet an aristocrat in spiritual crisis could find. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, the samurai nobility, a hybrid class, often found themselves pulled between competing codes, Shinto ritual, and Buddhist detachment. Some turned to Zen, hoping that meditation might quiet the turmoil within. Others wrote poetry not merely as art, but as a kind of spiritual release. Still, the strain between duty, honor, and the impermanence of all things gnawed at them. When a noble took his own life through the ritual of seppuku, it was not always about shame. Sometimes it was about a spiritual release. For all their silks and titles, nobles were frequently deeply lost. Surrounded by ritual and grandeur, many still gazed into the emptiness, wondering whether any of it truly mattered. Behind the masks of status, their souls were whispering and at times crying out for peace. In the age before smartphones and email, the most dangerous thing a noble could send was not an assassin. It was a letter. Ink on parchment could unmake a dynasty, lay bare an affair, or touch off a revolution. And nobles, for all their outward polish, were relentless correspondents. They committed everything to the page: secrets, longings, schemes, prayers, love, and lies alike. These were not idle exchanges between pen pals. They were deliberate instruments of diplomacy and survival. At Versailles, every noble left a paper trail: love notes to mistresses, appeals to creditors, carefully phrased flattery aimed at the king. And by no means was all of it honest. Couriers carried sealed messages written in invisible ink or in cipher. A single wrong phrase in the wrong hands could send someone into exile or onto the scaffold. Some nobles even kept personal ciphers, alphabets devised for no purpose but secret conversation. The Duke of Orléans, for one, was known to write to suspected radicals in the run-up to the French Revolution, his letters carefully encoded. But ciphers were never entirely safe. In one famous case, a noble's encrypted diary was cracked long after his death, uncovering a hidden life of treason and betrayal. In the Habsburg courts, marriage negotiations were often conducted in veiled language. A letter might open with talk of weather and falconry while concealing far deeper aims between the lines. Parents arranged matches through polite untruths. Lovers pleaded for elopement under the pretense of visiting country estates. In Japan's Heian era, poetry itself served as code. A single waka, just 31 syllables, could carry forbidden love, refusal, or the promise of a secret meeting. Noble women were especially adept at composing verses of double meaning, often answering in kind within hours. These exchanges travelled by discreet messengers, sometimes servants, sometimes children, always sworn to silence. During the Renaissance, some noble women ran whole networks of espionage out of their salons, writing to allies in foreign courts. In Russia, letters smuggled out of the Tsar's inner circle helped feed uprisings. Nobles caught in gilded cages turned to correspondence as their one form of rebellion. Paper became weapon, shield, and confessional all at once. The riskiest letters, of course, were the ones that never arrived. Intercepted, burned, buried. Some lay hidden in attics and gaps in the walls for centuries, their secrets unread, their writers long forgotten. But make no mistake, Within those ink-stained lines lived revolutions, heartbreak, and the rawest truths of the noble soul. In noble society, emotion was a luxury no one could truly afford. Joy, anger, fear, all of it was carefully measured, rationed, or hidden away completely. A noble's survival rested not only on wealth or title, but on mastering the art of emotional disguise. To hold one's place at court, a person had to perform and never ever flinch. At Versailles, life was theatre without an intermission. Nobles rehearsed their smiles, their bows, their silences. A single raised eyebrow could signal support or quiet sabotage. Tears were kept for funerals, and even then only when the watching eyes of courtly judgment were turned that way. The aim was simple: project elegance and bury the chaos. Those who failed at it were labelled unstable, hysterical, or, worse, unfit. This emotional choreography was taught early. Noble children learned to speak only when spoken to carry pride without arrogance, and to hold back grief until it could be confided to a private diary. A loss of composure was not merely embarrassing, it was politically dangerous. One outburst might be remembered for decades and turned into ammunition in later rivalries. In Japan's Heian court, restraint was refined still further. Public emotion was considered vulgar. One's real feelings were revealed only through metaphor, in poetry, in gesture, or in carefully chosen silence. A noblewoman's sleeve might say more than her words ever could. A fan opened only halfway could hint at heartbreak. A cherry blossom picked too soon, despair. To survive, one had to command subtlety as fluently as any language. In England, nobles maintained the stiff upper lip. A scandal could be quietly washed down with a brandy, but never actually spoken of. Behind closed doors, though, journals wept in their place. Volumes of sorrow and stifled anger, bound in leather and shut away in desk drawers. Mental strain, grief, shame, all of it hidden behind ballroom smiles and a soldier's bearing. Some gave way under the weight. There are records of nobles who faltered in the middle of a dance or collapsed during ceremonies, later kept in care or sent off to recover on remote estates. But these were tragedies spoken of only in whispers. The show, after all, had to go on, because in the grand masquerade of nobility, emotion was a liability. Masks were not only for balls, they were everyday dress. And behind every bow, every compliment, every graceful laugh, a storm often raged, flawlessly concealed beneath silk and etiquette. To be born noble was to inherit not only land and titles, but expectations so heavy they could crush the spirit. From the very first breath, a noble child was less a person than a vessel for legacy. Every choice they made was shadowed by the demands of their ancestors and the judgment of generations not yet born. In France, the sons of dukes and counts were groomed like racehorses. Their futures were laid out in ledgers and family trees. Marry this heiress. Cultivate that prince. Do nothing to shame the bloodline. Their lives simply carried on a strategy begun long before their birth, one they usually had no power to change. Even the women were pieces on the family chessboard. A duchess's worth was often reckoned by the size of her dowry and the purity of her lineage. England's aristocracy carried much the same weight. Firstborn sons inherited the estate, the debt, the household staff, and the duty of keeping the family from disgrace, or, worse yet, from trade. Those who failed were remembered not for who they were, but as the one who lost the manor. Younger sons, meanwhile, left without land or title, were quietly steered into the church or the military with little say in the matter. In Russia, noble families held their status like a ticking device. One misstep, one quarrel with the wrong court faction, and everything might be seized. Land, serfs, even the family name could be stripped away. Generations of effort erased with a single signature. Japan's aristocracy was more rigid still. In the Heian period, noble families jockeyed for nearness to the emperor. Positions and influence passed down not through merit, but through lineage. A single disgrace, a failed marriage, an unruly son could undo centuries of prestige. The pressure to conform was immense, and individuality was often sacrificed on the altar of ancestral duty. And what of those who wanted none of it, who had no wish to marry the stranger, to rule the estate, or to carry the name? Rebellion was not merely difficult, it was unthinkable. A few tried. Most were ground down by the machinery of tradition. The burden of inheritance was not only financial or political, it was psychological, a crown of thorns worn beneath a golden halo. To be noble was to be chained to a legacy, whether you had asked for it or not. Not every noble followed the script. Beneath layers of etiquette and centuries of family pressure, some cracked and others resisted. But rebellion among the nobility was not always dramatic. There were no peasant uprisings here, no flaming torches, only quiet, subversive acts tucked into the corners of palaces, hidden behind locked doors, or dressed up as tradition. At Versailles, where conformity ruled above all, rebellion took on strange forms. Some nobles quietly declined to appear at the king's grand morning ceremony, and that absence, small as it seemed, was a serious insult that hinted at independence. Others took the risk of dressing in shades that had fallen out of fashion, or arranged for portraits that made no effort to flatter them. A handful shocked their relatives by choosing partners out of affection rather than strategic alliance. In the delicate machinery of court politics, gestures this minor carried the force of a blast. Across England, certain aristocrats surprised everyone by devoting themselves to art and writing. Lord Byron was not merely a poet, his entire existence seemed to sneer at the idea of noble self-control. Dressing across convention, roaming abroad with companions, holding Parliament in contempt, his life read as one long, deliberate provocation. Quieter nobles simply slipped away to the countryside, stepping back from the endless obligations of London society. Even that could be understood as a form of defiance, a refusal to take part in the game. In Russia, that quiet dissent could take far riskier shapes. Some nobles lent secret support to revolutionary ideas, dressing up radical philosophy as innocent gatherings for poetry. Others assisted serfs in escaping, or gave them an education, both treasonous under the rule of the Tsar. These were not thunderous uprisings, but soft betrayals of a system already failing. Japanese nobles had even more understated ways of rebelling. A poem offered at the wrong moment, a present carrying a concealed insult, a refusal to shave one's head during mourning. Any of these could be taken as a rejection of custom. Certain noblewomen pushed back against arranged marriages by falling in love through the exchange of verse, subtle and yet scandalous. Others retreated into religious life, not from devotion, but as a form of protest. And then there were the ones who simply faded from view. Nobles who feigned sickness to escape the court, who buried themselves in shadowy libraries, pretending to be too absorbed in astronomy or botany to bother with the theatre of the court. Their withdrawal was not frailty, it was resistance. These rebels seldom found their way into the history books, yet their choices, however quiet, wore away at the illusion of flawless obedience. Not every noble kept to the rules. A few murmured no, and in their world, that murmur rang out louder than any shout. For all the pageantry and posing, the nobility fixated on one thing more than any other: legacy. Not the kind that is felt, but the kind that can be carved, painted, marched through the streets, and handed down the generations. Portraits rendered in oil, family crests cut into marble, sprawling estates with names longer than certain novels. Every ball, every battle, every betrothal fed into one ceaseless effort to be remembered. Yet here lies the awkward truth: most of them were not. Certainly we recall the monarchs, the kings who set wars in motion, the queens who met terrible ends. But the ordinary noble slipped from memory. Their careful rituals, their squabbles, their costly footwear vanished the way breath fades from glass. What lingers are only scraps, letters with no signature, the collapsing walls of estates, obscure entries in household ledgers. The sweeping tale of the aristocracy is not one of everlasting glory. It is one of selective survival. In France, the revolution did more than end lives. It wiped whole bloodlines from remembrance. Portraits were scarred, names were forbidden. The very people who had agonized over how history would judge them were instead brushed aside by it. A few endured, of course, by taking new names, tucking jewels behind fireplace bricks, or escaping to courts abroad. But the legacies they left were not the ones they had planned. They turned into warnings, not immortals. England's nobles came through more comfortably, shielded by law, rich in land, woven into the institutions. Even so, they were not spared from fading into irrelevance. Estates that once hummed with activity now sit in ruin. Dust settles over tapestries that once cost a fortune. Many of the great names dissolve through scandal, unwise marriages, or the simple passage of time. A line with no heirs is a legacy with no tomorrow. In Japan, the aristocracy was in time overshadowed by the warrior class, the samurai, and the shogunate. The intricate poetry, the ranks of the court, the ceremonies all dimmed. And while a handful of families can still trace themselves to ancient noble houses, the modern world tends not to care. Even the proudest names became labels in a museum. And what became of those who tried to steer the story, commissioning grand biographies, dictating their memoirs, funding churches? They too fell under history's selective memory. Often the truer stories, the shame, the secrets, the compromises, endure only in whispers, in footnotes, or in letters kept from sight. In the end, legacy proved the greatest illusion of all. Nobles lived in pursuit of being remembered and were frequently forgotten completely. Behind the portraits in the palaces rests a quiet fact. Permanence was never real, only the performance was. In the spring of 1900, a peculiar man in a broad-brimmed hat stood in the sunlight, gazing at scattered stones and walls only half free of the earth. This was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, historian, and something of an eccentric dreamer. He had come to Crete not simply to dig up ruins, but to hunt a ghost, the ghost of a civilization that had lingered in Greek legend for centuries. A people so ancient they had slipped between the cracks of both history and myth. For years, travellers and locals had described odd objects rising from the hills south of Heraklion. Pottery older than anything, Mycenaean, strange symbols no one could read, and ruins that fit no known style of Greek building. Evans was certain these were the remnants of a Bronze Age, people older than Homer, older than Athens, who had once held sway over the Aegean. Then came the moment that turned everything around. On a stretch of ground called Kefala Hill, Evans and his workers uncovered an enormous structure sunk beneath ages of dust and rubble. Walls came into view, not humble huts, but the foundations of rooms, of staircases, of corridors. One so intricate it seemed built to bewilder anyone who stepped inside. A labyrinth, perhaps. Evans made the link at once. This surely had to be the palace of Kossos, the fabled seat of King Minos. The same Minos who, as the myth told it, had confined the half-man, half-bull Minotaur deep inside a maze beneath his household. Myth or not, the ruins answered the story. Endless winding halls, level upon level, puzzling dead ends. It was a palace that scorned logic, as though designed to ensnare not only people, but time itself. He named the people who had raised it the Minoans, after Minos. What they had called themselves, no one could say. Their script, known as linear, remained unread. But their art, their architecture, and the reach of their influence pointed to an empire long since lost. And so, trowel in hand and a myth in mind, Evans set about lifting away the centuries. What he uncovered would upend everything people believed about early European civilization and spark fresh arguments that still have not been laid to rest. The Palace of Knossos is not a palace in the usual sense. It is a puzzle assembled from corridors, courts, and chambers that appear to fold back on themselves at every turn. Spreading across more than 150,000 square feet, the structure was a multi-story wonder of the ancient world. And at its core lay a contradiction. How could something so open, so filled with light and so advanced feel so impossible to chart? There were no towering ramparts or moats, no military watchtowers. Instead, Knossos held balconies, skylights, and air shafts, features unheard of in Bronze Age Europe. The whole complex seemed shaped not for war, but for ceremony, for administration, and perhaps for mystery. Staircases coiled in dizzying spirals. Slender corridors gave onto sudden courtyards, and rooms joined together in unexpected ways. Scholars have argued for over 100 years about whether this design was deliberate, a symbolic echo of the labyrinth of legend, or merely the outcome of centuries of rebuilding. To move through Knossos is to give up any sense of direction. There are rooms nested within rooms, wings that loop back into one another, and passages that lead nowhere at all. Evans believed the layout mirrored the tale of Daedalus, the legendary craftsman who had built the labyrinth so King Minos could imprison the Minotaur. While there is no archaeological trace of an actual creature, the disorientation felt in walking the site is entirely real. And yet the palace was more than a maze. It was a marvel of ancient engineering. The complex boasted sophisticated plumbing, with terracotta pipes, flushing toilets, and a drainage system so effective it would have shamed parts of 19th century Europe. Rooms drew in natural ventilation. Light wells brightened the inner chambers. Some staircases dropped down 3 or 4 stories, hinting at a deep, tiered structure rarely seen before the modern age. The throne room, modest by royal measures, sits deep within, almost concealed. Its centerpiece is a stone seat flanked by frescoes of griffins and ringed by benches. This was not a place of spectacle, but of measured ritual. Perhaps here power leaned less on domination and more on illusion, on mysticism, on religious awe. Knossos was not raised to intimidate. It was raised to mystify. Whether you came as a trader, a priestess, or a foreign envoy, one thing held true. Once you entered, the palace swallowed you whole and made you lose all memory of the way you had come. Though the stone walls of Knossos are crumbling, their colours still speak. Sealed beneath volcanic ash and the weight of time, the palace's frescoes came to light as some of the most vivid, puzzling, and advanced artworks of the ancient world. Unlike the stiff martial art of later Greek or Egyptian societies, the Minoan frescoes brimmed with motion, with dancers, dolphins, bulls, and goddesses. They did more than dress the walls. They spun stories, gestured at rituals, and revealed a civilization that seemed to cherish life, beauty, and rhythm. Among the most famous images from Knossos is the bull leaping fresco, a youthful figure vaulting over an immense bull in an elegant, impossible arc. Was it real? Was it myth? Historians have debated the question for more than a century. Was it a ritual sport, a religious offering, or simply a metaphor for taming chaos? Whatever it meant, the image captures something essential about Minoan life, a dance with danger, grace at its very centre. Elsewhere the walls flower, with lilies and crocuses, with monkeys and birds, with spirals and waves. In the Prince of the Lilies fresco, a slim youth with flowing hair and an elaborate crown strides with ceremonial assurance. Though Evans first took him for a prince, modern scholars are less sure. The figure might be a priest or even a goddess. Gender in Minoan art is fluid, symbolic, and still deeply mysterious. Unlike so many ancient civilizations, the Minoans did not center their art on kings, wars, or conquests. There are no scenes of battle or bondage. Instead, there are moments of celebration, of nature, of sacred rite. Women stand at the heart of it, not in the background, but front and center. Priestesses in elaborate skirts, hair coiled high, perform rituals, suggesting that women may have held significant, even leading, religious roles. And the colors, deep reds, blues, and whites, still cling to the plaster after thousands of years, defying time itself. The vibrancy of the artwork hints at a society that not only prized beauty, but grasped its emotional power. These were not merely lovely paintings. They were emblems of cosmic order, of human joy, of spiritual reverence. In the palace of Knossos, the walls did not simply witness history, they sang it. In pigment and pattern, the Minoans painted a world of movement, mystery, and meaning. Among the many riddles of Knossos, one rises above the rest, the prominence of women. Unlike many societies of its era, in which women were pushed to the edges, the Minoans set them at the center, both literally and symbolically. Their images dominate the frescoes, the figurines, and the ceremonial scenes, hinting at a civilization where female power was not concealed. It was honored in the central court and the sacred chambers of Knossos. Depictions of women in flounced skirts and ornate headdresses appear again and again. These were not meek figures tucked behind kings. They stood front and center, arms lifted in blessing, holding serpents, encircled by symbols of fertility, by animals, by divine energy. Scholars think many of these women were priestesses, go-betweens linking the mortal and the divine, charged with overseeing rituals that reached into every corner of Minoan life. One of the best-known artifacts from the palace is the snake goddess figurine, a woman with a piercing gaze grasping serpents in both hands, a feline crouched upon her head. Was she a deity, a high priestess, an image of female sovereignty? In contrast, no comparable figure of a male Minoan ruler has ever surfaced in the art. There is no towering statue of a king, no carved scene celebrating a warlord's conquests. This absence has prompted many researchers to propose that Minoan society may have been matriarchal, or at the very least remarkably balanced for its age. Women probably held sway in both religious life and perhaps governance as well, overseeing the festivals of the seasons, tending the temples, and carrying out the rituals of state. Even the layout of the buildings seems to echo this equilibrium. Chambers thought to belong to women of high rank, with their own passage to shrines, light wells, and private stairways, imply they could move about the palace with ease. Certain frescoes show women joined together in ceremonial parades, clothed in bright fabrics, their bearing assured rather than submissive. At Knossos, the feminine was not kept in shadow. It was regarded as sacred. Whether serving as priestesses, as leaders, or as emblems of renewal, women were not a lesser part of Minoan life. They were its essence, its voice, its outlook, and perhaps its very spirit. Knossos was far more than a home for royalty. It was a stage set for the sacred. Every hallway, courtyard, and room appears to have carried a spiritual charge. From chambers buried underground to altars washed in sunlight, the palace was raised not simply for daily living, but for reaching toward the divine. And though no Minoan scripture has come down to us, the stonework itself murmurs of the ceremonies that gave shape to their world. Scattered through the palace were dozens of little shrines and ritual rooms, many folded into hidden corners or hollowed out far below the surface. These were not spaces for the crowds. They were close, secretive, and probably reserved for the priestly few. One room, commonly named the lustral basin, holds a sunken tub-like hollow at the foot of a slender stairway, made not for washing the body, but most likely for rites of purification. Perhaps newcomers stepped down in silence, cleansed by waters rich in meaning before joining the sacred ceremonies. The central court, broad and open beneath the sky, was in all likelihood the core of public ceremony. Here hundreds may have assembled for the festivals of the seasons, honouring fertility, renewal, or the turning of the year. And ever present in these rites was the bull, that mighty emblem of strength, vitality, and the natural world. All through the palace, bull horns, sculpted large and stylized, were set atop walls and above doorways. These horns of consecration, as Evans named them, signalled sacred boundaries. Together with the bull-leaping scenes preserved in fresco, it becomes plain that this creature carried profound religious weight. Some hold that a living bull may even have taken part in certain rituals, not in cruel slaughter, but as a companion in a spiritual display meant to reflect the endless interplay of chaos and order. The double axe, or labrys, was one more symbol regularly tied to the sacred spaces of Knossos, carved into pillars and walls. It might have been a tool, a weapon, or a mark of the divine. Its recurring appearance alongside female figures lends further weight to the notion of a religion centered on a goddess. No temples in the usual sense are found at Knossos. Instead, the palace itself served as the temple, each stairwell a procession route, each chamber a chapel. It was a place where the spiritual and the political became one, where holiness was stitched into the very walls. Amid the frescoes, altars, and winding chambers of Knossos, excavators came upon something more baffling still: writing. Hundreds of clay tablets marked with symbols that to this day no one can fully make out. This was Linear A, the script of the Minoans, and one of the last great writing systems of the ancient world that remains unread. Brought to light during Evans's digs, Linear A resembled, on the surface, another script uncovered in Mycenaean Greece, known as Linear B. Evans assumed the two were connected, and indeed they were. Yet while Linear B was eventually cracked and shown to be an early form of Greek, Linear A obstinately held on to its mysteries. It is a tongue with no link to Greek and perhaps no link to any language known on Earth. We can sound out its characters, but their meaning escapes us. The majority of Linear A tablets found at Knossos are administrative lists of grain, oil, livestock, or offerings. But without command of the language, the surrounding meaning stays out of reach. Were these tax records, ritual gifts, market accounts? No one can say for certain. The Minoans kept writing for more than 5 centuries, and still we cannot grasp a single complete sentence. This blackout of language lends Knossos its dreamlike quality. It is like hearing music through a wall. You can catch the rhythm, the energy, the intention, but the words stay muffled forever. We can view their rituals in art and their architecture in stone, yet their thoughts remain sealed away. Linear A was pressed with a stylus into soft clay, then hardened by accident, kept only because the palace was consumed by fire. Without that ruin, their words might have crumbled to nothing long ago. In a strange twist, the burning of Knossos handed us the only surviving pieces of the Minoan language. Some scholars think Linear A may yet be deciphered one day, above all should bilingual texts come to light, in the way the Rosetta Stone opened up Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until that moment we are left holding scattered symbols. A man, a bull, a jar, a sun, without meaning, yet strangely familiar. Knossos, for all its colour and intricacy, addresses us in silence. Its language rests just out of reach, a reminder that some of history's greatest voices are still waiting to be heard, buried not in the ground but in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, once a beacon of art, architecture and ritual, did not disappear in one great catastrophe. Its fall came not swiftly but in layers, the gradual unravelling of a civilization whose power once appeared everlasting. And as with so many ancient collapses, the truth behind the downfall of Knossos is woven from fire, water and murmurs of war. Around 1450 BCE, something shifted. All at once, across Crete, Minoan palaces and towns began to burn. Knossos, curiously, did not fall right away. Instead, it was settled again. But the frescoes changed. The writing on the clay tablets moved from Linear A to Linear B, no longer Minoan but Mycenaean Greek. This hints that the Mycenaeans, the rising power from the mainland, had either invaded or taken hold peacefully after some disaster had weakened the Minoans. Whatever the means, Knossos was no longer governed by its native people. One theory looks to the eruption of Thera, a volcanic blast on the island of Santorini just north of Crete around 1600 BCE. This upheaval was among the most powerful in recorded history, ravaging the region with earthquakes and tsunamis. The turmoil that followed may have crippled the Minoan economy, wrecked their harbours, and drained their influence, leaving them open to invasion or collapse from within. Others make the case for a slow economic and political decline. As trade routes moved and rivals gained strength, the centralized power of Knossos may have splintered. The palace, once humming with life, grew more administrative, more subdued. Ritual gave way to record-keeping. Art gave way to imitation. By 1375 BCE, the palace was abandoned altogether. Fires swept through its halls, roofs caved in, walls cracked and buckled. Knossos was left in silence, its colours dimming, its language unread, its rituals forgotten. And yet it was never wholly lost. Tales of the labyrinth and the Minotaur endured in Greek myth. Traces of Minoan influence echoed through Mycenaean palaces, and later through classical art and architecture. The soul of Knossos lingered like smoke, unseen but present. Today its ruins lie open to the sun once more. Visitors walk where priestesses once danced. And the palace that once held a civilization together now holds its secrets in plain view, majestic, mysterious, and unfinished. When Sir Arthur Evans brought Knossos to light in 1900, he did not merely dig it out of the ground. He reimagined it, blending scholarly ambition with an artist's eye. Evans aimed not only to safeguard the ruins, but to breathe life back into them. He was convinced that laying bare the foundations alone would not do. The world, he felt, needed to behold the palace as he believed it had once stood, colourful, intricate, and awe-inspiring. What came next was one of the most disputed restorations in the history of archaeology. Using concrete, a substance utterly foreign to the Bronze Age, Evans rebuilt portions of the palace with modern techniques. He hired artists to repaint frescoes from fragments recovered on site, though they often supplied the missing pieces from guesswork rather than proof. Balconies were reconstructed. Columns were restored not in plain stone, but painted red with black caps, following Evans's idea of Minoan taste. Rooms were roofed over, walls were replastered, and the ancient palace slowly turned into a hybrid, part ruin, part Edwardian fantasy. Some praised his daring. Without Evans, they argued, Knossos might have stayed just another jumble of unremarkable ruins. His reconstructions rendered the site approachable, instructive, and emotionally stirring. Visitors could stroll through halls that felt alive, take in murals ablaze with colour, and picture the world of the Minoans more vividly than ever before. But others viewed it another way. Critics charged Evans with going too far, with laying his own interpretation over a civilization we still scarcely grasp. The frescoes, for one, were at times all but invented from tiny shards of original paint. Entire portions of the palace, such as the celebrated throne room, may have been given roles they never actually served. By moulding the ruins to fit the myth, Evans may have smudged the boundary between archaeology and storytelling. Today, Knossos stands as both a marvel and a monument to the tangled business of historical reconstruction. Evans's vision cannot be pried apart from the site. His concrete structures still stand. His artistic interpretations still tint the walls. But visitors move through Knossos with a double awareness of what the Minoans might have built, and of what one impassioned archaeologist believed they did. In striving to bring Knossos back to life, Evans may have left us two palaces, one ancient and buried in the earth, and one imagined, rising boldly above it. Today the Palace of Knossos stands not only as a ruin but as a bridge between myth and history, imagination and evidence, Europe and the ancient world. Long after its final ritual was carried out and its halls fell quiet, Knossos goes on fascinating, mystifying, and provoking. Its mere existence unsettles our assumptions about early civilization and forces us to face how little we still know. The palace helped redraw the timeline of European history. Before it came to light, most scholars held that advanced civilization began with the Greeks. Knossos rewrote that account. Here was a culture thriving 1,000 years earlier, with plumbing, urban planning, international trade, and symbolic art. The Minoans, centered at Knossos, were no primitives. They were sophisticated, expressive, and deeply spiritual. But the legacy of Knossos cannot be separated from its mythology. For thousands of years, the tale of the Minotaur in the labyrinth was brushed aside as fiction, a fable meant to frighten or amuse. And yet, when archaeologists uncovered a palace with hundreds of rooms, corridors that looped and twisted, and bull symbols carved into stone, the boundary between myth and history grew faint. Perhaps the legend was not invented, but remembered, passed through the generations until only fragments remained. In modern times, Knossos has stirred not only scholars but writers, artists and architects. Its double axes, horned emblems and flowing frescoes have turned up in fashion, sculpture and even science fiction. The idea of a hidden ancient civilization beneath the Mediterranean still feeds the imagination, a vision of an age when power meant not pyramids or conquest, but beauty, ritual and balance. Yet Knossos also reminds us of fragility. The palace fell. Its language was lost. Its people faded away. And its meaning, its true original purpose, is still debated. Every interpretation is a mirror, reflecting not only the past, but what we wish to believe about it. It is to stand at the heart of the oldest palace in Europe, a place that existed somewhere between daylight and dark, between stone and story. Knossos may keep some of its secrets forever, yet even in its stillness it goes on speaking of mystery, of memory, and of the winding path that civilization has walked. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus came into the world on the 15th of December in the year 37 CE. He was born to advantage, but also into a family steeped in danger. His bloodline was imperial, wound tightly into the Julio-Claudian dynasty that governed Rome with equal measures of grandeur and suspicion. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of the Emperor Caligula, a great-granddaughter of Augustus, and among the shrewdest political minds of her generation. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, carried a reputation for pride and cruelty. The story goes that when a well-wisher offered congratulations on the boy's birth, he grumbled that nothing produced by himself and Agrippina could be anything but a horror. Whether that was foresight or simple sourness, the years ahead would decide. When the boy who would be called Nero was only 2, his father died of dropsy, though poison was never ruled out. In a Rome where alliances could turn deadly and ambition was treated like sport, Agrippina was left a widow with a small child and no genuine authority. But she knew how to wait. She looked on as her brother Caligula descended into cruelty and was cut down by his own guards. She said nothing while Claudius, the bookish, stammering uncle, was raised to the throne. And then she acted. By 49 CE, Agrippina had drawn in the Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and married him. She made no secret of her intentions. Inside a year, she had persuaded him to name her son as his heir, stepping over his own natural son, Britannicus. Lucius took a new name, Nero. Claudius Caesar. Drusus. Germanicus, a title suited to emperors. She secured his betrothal to Claudius's daughter Octavia and brought in the best teachers Rome could offer to shape him. Foremost among them was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who worked to form the young man into a worthy ruler. To outside eyes, Nero was being prepared for greatness. Schooled in rhetoric, poetry, philosophy and music, he learned to hold a crowd, to recite Homer, and to sway what people thought. Yet Agrippina kept her grip firm. She stood at his side during ceremonies, ran his household, and left no doubt about where real power lay. Nero's ascent was no gift of fate. It was the careful work of a mother who had thought of herself as empress long before her son ever held a crown. And within that gilded cradle of ambition and manoeuvring, the roots of a turbulent reign were already taking hold. In 54 CE, at only 16, Nero became Emperor of Rome. Claudius, his adoptive father, had died, officially of sickness, though many suspected poison, and suspicion pointed first at Agrippina. She had grown weary of waiting, and when Claudius seemed to be looking again toward his own son Britannicus as heir, she moved. Mushrooms, so the tales claimed, were how it was done, the food of the gods, some said grimly, and perhaps the food of murder as well. With Claudius gone, Nero was hurried into power. The Senate gave its blessing, the Praetorian Guard cheered, and Agrippina stood in triumph behind him, clothed in gold and ringed by soldiers, the true builder of the new regime. But she had not raised an emperor. She had assembled a puppet. In the first months of Nero's rule, Rome flourished. He handed out generous rewards to the soldiers, staged public games, and pledged a return to the values of Augustus. Away from public view, two men managed the actual business of governing. Seneca, the philosopher-tutor, now turned author of his speeches, and Burrus, the level-headed commander of the Praetorian Guard. Between them they guided Nero through difficult decisions while preserving an appearance of dignified restraint. Agrippina, however, had no intention of standing off stage. She had expected to reign alongside her son, and as Nero began to test his own independence, the friction burst open. In the beginning, the clashes were quiet. She insisted on appearing on coins beside Nero's likeness, something no Roman mother had ever done. She pushed her way into meetings of state. She entered the Senate chamber without being asked. She reminded Nero again and again who had made him emperor. The young ruler bristled under her hand. He began gathering his own circle of advisers, men devoted to pleasure and art rather than to duty. He fell in love with Act, once an enslaved girl, to Agrippina's dismay, for she had imagined a royal match, not a romance with a commoner. The closeness that had once bound mother and son started to curdle. Word moved through the palace of raised voices, doors thrown shut, and quiet threats. Agrippina, once celebrated as the maker of an emperor, now began to look like a danger. Rome had handed Nero a throne, but Agrippina still held the leash, and Nero was starting to reach for the blade. His reign had opened with promise, with poetry and applause, yet behind the scenes a family tragedy was already gathering, one that would mark the imperial purple with blood. By 59 CE, the imperial palace had become a battlefield, not of soldiers, but of two competing wills. Nero was emperor in title, yet his mother Agrippina still hung like a gathering storm over every choice. She chipped away at his authority, disapproved of his private life, and schemed in the background to trade him for Britannicus, the natural son of the late Claudius. Nero, once the dutiful boy beside his tutor, had grown into a young man desperate to shake off her hold. He struck first. Britannicus, a genuine danger to his throne, died without warning at a banquet. Guests said he had choked on his wine, but the poison worked so swiftly that his death could hardly be mistaken for an accident. Nero denied any part in it. Almost no one believed him, least of all Agrippina. With Britannicus dead, Nero's next difficulty was his mother. She had once ruled through him, now he regarded her as a rival. Agrippina was not merely ambitious, she was tireless. She met with senators in private. She showed off noblemen she hoped to raise up as alternatives. She dropped hints about where the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard truly lay. And worst of all, from Nero's point of view, the people still loved her. Rome admired forceful women, so long as they did not become too forceful, and Agrippina had stepped past that line. Nero first attempted exile. He took away her bodyguards, withdrew her from public life, and sent her off to a villa on the coast. But distance did not quiet her. She still wrote letters, still murmured to the right ears, still tugged at hidden threads. So Nero chose a darker road. He invited Agrippina to a great festival and gave her a splendid vessel for her journey home, a ship that had been built to fall apart at sea. When the rigged boat broke up, Agrippina survived, swimming to the shore by moonlight. The bungled attempt left Nero furious and humiliated, so he tried once more. This time he dispatched men to her villa under the cover of bringing an urgent message. The accounts differ, but one tells that she met her killers with composure, telling them to strike at the wound that had brought Nero into the world. Her death sent tremors through the empire. Nero's guilt came at once and would not release him. Sleep escaped him. He walked the corridors at night. He imagined her spirit in the halls. Rome, too, spoke in hushed tones of the unthinkable, an emperor who had killed his own mother. With Agrippina gone, Nero had at last cut himself loose, but in doing so he had also snapped the last cord holding him to restraint. What came next would be a reign unbound by shame, sliding steadily toward disgrace. With Agrippina gone, Nero was emperor without limit at last. No more murmured counsel, no more watchful mother, only power with nothing to soften it. Yet rather than turn that power toward conquest or the work of reform, Nero turned it inward. He had no wish to be remembered as a governor of the state. He longed to be loved as an artist. He saw himself as a poet, a singer, an actor. He performed in public, something no Roman emperor had ever dared. To the Senate and the aristocracy it was humiliating, for in Roman custom the stage belonged to slaves and to foreigners. Nero was unbothered. He studied music and drama, demanded applause, and packed amphitheatres with audiences whose enthusiasm was less than voluntary. The emperor did not simply host the games, he performed in them. He wrote verses, sang mournful pieces, and delivered long epics of his own making. He took great pride in his voice and even submitted to peculiar regimens meant to protect it, including purging rituals, long stretches of silence, and strange diets. Senators endured performances that ran for hours, afraid to rise from their seats, since failing to applaud might bring exile or something worse. He also poured resources into raising theatres, backing athletic competitions, and reshaping Rome to suit his tastes. He brought in Greek-style contests, such as the Neronia, a mixture of Olympic sport and theatrical rivalry in which, to no one's surprise, Nero always claimed first place. His fixation on performance seeped into his handling of affairs abroad. On a journey through Greece, he insisted on entering every artistic competition. At the Olympic Games, he took part in a chariot race with 10 horses rather than the usual 4. He was thrown from the chariot partway through, yet was still declared the winner, on the reasoning that he surely would have won had he not fallen, which in Nero's eyes counted as a genuine triumph. And yet, while he lost himself in these creative pursuits, the empire strained under the neglect. Administration was ignored, governors acted with no one watching over them, and the provinces grew uneasy. Nero paid it little mind. He was not trying to be another Augustus or Tiberius. He wished to be Orpheus or Apollo, or perhaps something greater still, a god of music wielding absolute power. To the Roman elite he was turning into a national embarrassment, but to the common people, kept content with bread, games, and endless spectacle, Nero was a living wonder, a flawed god upon a stage, singing over the widening cracks in a crumbling empire. In July of 64 CE, a fire caught near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, the flames were racing through the city like a curse from the heavens. The streets of Rome, cramped, crowded, and easily set alight, became a furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights the capital of the empire burned. When it was over, 10 of the city's 14 districts lay in ruins. Countless people were left without homes. Temples, houses, and marketplaces were simply gone. And where had the emperor been? The rumours multiplied. Some said Nero had watched the blaze from a tower, plucking his lyre and singing of the fall of Troy. Others insisted he had set the fire himself to clear ground for a new palace. Nero denied both, and in fact he was not even in the city when the fire started. Yet when he returned, he responded with a flair for the dramatic, opening his private gardens to those who had lost everything, arranging emergency supplies of food, and paying for reconstruction. Still, the whispers would not fade. People wanted someone to blame, and Nero, ever the showman, supplied one. He accused the Christians. They were already regarded with distrust, an odd sect grown out of Judaism that worshipped a crucified man and would not honor the Roman gods. He charged them with setting the fire and launched a persecution so harsh that its memory would carry down through the centuries. Christians were set upon by dogs, crucified, and, most terribly, burned to light Nero's garden gatherings. It was not justice. It was spectacle staged by firelight. Meanwhile, Nero revealed his real ambition, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. On the ashes of central Rome, he began raising a palace of pleasure on a scale that beggared belief, with man-made lakes, walls sheathed in gold, dining rooms that turned, and ceilings that scattered perfume. A towering statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, was meant to loom over the whole of it. To many Romans, this only confirmed what they had feared. Nero had not merely allowed the city to burn, he had treated the fire as an empty canvas. He had wiped away the old Rome in order to paint a new one with himself at its centre. Nero, though, saw it another way. In his own mind, he was not destroying, but creating, remaking Rome in his own likeness, dramatic, divine, and impossible to forget. In his effort to make himself immortal through art and stone, Nero scorched the ground and set light to the fuse of his own ruin. As his reign wore on, the applause thinned and fear moved in to take its place. The emperor who had once danced across the stage now walked the palace halls in deepening unease, seeing enemies in every shadow and plots in every murmur. The artist emperor had become a tyrant behind a mask of stage paint. Following the fire and the deeply resented building of his golden palace, the emperor's relationship with the Senate soured with remarkable speed. The aristocracy, already stung by his stage performances and his lavish spending, now began to fear for their own survival. In the year 65, a conspiracy came to light. Known as the Pisonian Plot, it drew in scores of senators, equestrians, and even soldiers, all bound together in a design to remove him. Some hoped to bring back the Republic. Others cared only that the next ruler be anyone other than Nero. His reaction was quick and merciless. The poet Lucan, the philosopher Seneca, and the commander Faenius Rufus were each instructed to take their own lives. Seneca, who had once been his teacher and served as a kind of conscience to him, opened his veins while speaking evenly of Stoic ideas. Even people merely whispered to have leaned toward the plotters were caught up in the reprisals. The palace turned into a place of executions, and the Senate chamber became a hushed theatre of compliance. The emperor's suspicion only grew heavier. He charged his own wife, Octavia, with unfaithfulness, an accusation so thin that it offended the reason of even those nearest to him. She was sent away and then put to death. Her severed head was carried to his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, as a grotesque gesture of devotion. Yet even Poppaea was not beyond harm. In a fit of temper, or perhaps during a drunken quarrel, Nero struck her in the stomach while she was carrying his child, and she died not long after. Some accounts say he grieved for days. Others insist that what he mourned was the loss of his inspiration rather than the woman herself. Poison became a familiar instrument of his rule. He leaned on the notorious Locusta, a woman whose mixtures had claimed emperors and rivals alike. At his direction, she instructed others, forming a small, sinister academy of assassins. By this point, his court had the look of a stage stained red. Every friend was a suspect, and every ally a possible traitor. Through all of it, Nero went on singing, performing, and believing himself adored. But his audience was thinning, the laughter had turned uneasy, and the blades were drawing nearer. While Nero occupied himself with performances and purges in the capital, the empire beyond its walls began to stir. The provinces, long the foundation of Rome's strength, grew restless beneath the burden of neglect, extortion, and his increasingly unpredictable rule. Taxes were heavy, governors were corrupt, and Rome's military reputation had weakened. In the far reaches of the empire, patience thinned and rebellion took root. The first fracture appeared in the east. In the year 66, the province of Judea broke into open revolt. Friction between Roman officials and the Jewish population had been building for years, fed by religious oppression and crushing taxation. When Nero's appointed governors profaned holy places and plundered treasuries, war erupted. The First Jewish-Roman War had begun, and it would prove costly for Rome. Nero sent one of his ablest generals, Vespasian, to put down the uprising, an act that would, with some irony, later prove ruinous to his own reign. In the west, meanwhile, the sky darkened further. In Gaul and Spain, Roman legions began to voice their displeasure. Nero's extravagant living, the devastation of Rome, and his cruelty had worn away the loyalty of nobles and soldiers alike. Governors such as Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul rose in open rebellion in the year 68, denouncing him as a shame to Rome, a self-absorbed entertainer unfit to wear the purple. Vindex was defeated on the battlefield, yet he triumphed in another sense, for his revolt gave others courage. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the formidable governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, withheld his recognition of Nero's authority and proclaimed himself a servant of the Senate and people of Rome. It was the first open demand for a change of ruler. In Rome, fear spread. Nero's supporters started to slip away or turn on him. The Senate, feeling the ground shift, grew bolder. The Praetorian Guard, once his most devoted defenders, had now been bought by Galba's agents. Their loyalty, like so much in his court, could be purchased. Nero tried to gather support. He wept, he pleaded, he even thought of escaping to the eastern provinces and coming back as a celebrated artist. But the moment had passed. The empire had turned on its self-proclaimed god of the stage. His isolation was total. The very provinces that had once applauded his rise now set the spark to his ruin. The emperor had lost his stage, and the curtain was coming down. The Praetorian Guard, once the iron ring around his throne, had pledged itself to Galba. The people of Rome, who had once been amused by his games and spectacles, now looked on in silence as the city seemed to hold its breath. The empire he had once tried to make into a stage had left him without a single spectator. When he woke on the 9th of June, messengers arrived with word that decided his fate. The Senate had named him an enemy of the state. He was to be seized and put to death by the old Roman method, his neck fixed in a forked stick and his body beaten, a fate meant to strip away all dignity. The man who had once played to admiring crowds would now perish humiliated and alone. Seized by panic, Nero fled the city in disguise. Wrapped in rough clothing and joined by a handful of loyal freedmen, he took shelter in the country villa of a former secretary beyond the city's edge. There, in a shadowed and overgrown garden, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors crouched in a pit and listened for riders approaching. Even in these final hours, his preoccupation with his own legacy did not dim. When he caught the sound of hooves in the distance, he is said to have exclaimed that a great artist was dying in him. It was not Rome he lamented, but himself, his gifts, his reputation, and the tragic shape of his ending. His companions urged him to take his own life, but he wavered. For all the harm he had done, he shrank from death. At last, as the soldiers closed in, he pressed a blade to his throat with the help of a freedman named Epaphroditus. The wound did not kill him at once, and as he weakened he murmured a few last words about faithfulness come too late. He was 30 years old. The soldiers found him near his end. The Senate, now under Galba, ordered a modest burial, with no state ceremony and no divine honours, only a quiet close to a turbulent reign. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line reaching back through Augustus, Tiberius and Claudius, came to an end. What followed was a fresh tempest of civil war and confusion, with emperors rising and falling in swift succession. Yet one thing was certain: Rome would not forget him. His body was scarcely cold before the stories began to grow. Some Romans were glad, some grieved, and still others murmured that he had not truly died, that he had slipped away to the east and would return one day. In the decades that followed, at least 3 impostors came forward claiming to be Nero restored to life, appearing in Asia Minor with lyres in their hands and songs upon their lips. The legend of Nero, it seemed, had only begun. For much of the Roman elite, the verdict was plain. He was a monster, a man consumed by his own grandeur who had killed his mother, burned his capital, and shamed the empire with his vain performances. The historians who recorded his life, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, cast him as a warning, the artist emperor who let vanity swallow virtue. And yet the view was not universal. Among the common people, Nero remained curiously well liked. He had lowered taxes, built public baths, and staged enormous games and distributions of grain. He gave Rome some of its grandest spectacles. A few even saw him as a champion of the ordinary Roman, crude perhaps, but open-handed. Centuries afterward, Christian writings would blacken his name still more, with early authors branding him the first Antichrist, and even suggesting he was the beast described in Revelation. He came to be remembered not merely as a poor ruler, but as a figure of cosmic evil. Even so, there was something strangely compelling about his story. He was not the cold and calculating tyrant that Tiberius or Caligula had been. He was theatrical, flamboyant, impulsive, and often absurd, governing like a man lost in an endless dream, imagining himself at once poet, god, and tragic hero. Even his death carried the feel of a scene from some lost Greek tragedy. In the centuries to come, artists, playwrights, and filmmakers would revive him as an emblem of fallen splendor, a ruler too enchanted by beauty to endure the ugliness that power demands. His name turned into a byword for excess and decay, a lesson in what unfolds when ego outgrows an empire. Yet perhaps his oddest legacy is this: he made power into performance. Long before the age of mass media, he grasped that image could rival policy in its force, and that whoever commands the story can shape how the future remembers. In that respect, he got what he wished for. 2,000 years on, we remember Nero still, not for governing Rome, but for etching his name into the stage of history.